Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now today I've invited Erik Fogg onto the podcast from a company called ProdPerfect, and he's going to challenge your own thinking about the right way to deploy software and asking how much of just doing what everybody else does is actually valuable and how it could be inadvertently holding your team back from what is possible. And since 2018, Erik and his team have helped dozens of cutting-edge venture-backed hotshot brand name companies and their elite engineering teams to radically improve their software quality and deployment speed. And I think in over 2019, they grew over 20% month over month and raised a beefy $12 million in Series A. And they're well on the warpath to Series B too. But enough scene setting from me. Buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to California, where Erik is waiting to speak with us now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love the show and was so excited when I got to join. So I'm Erik Fogg. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of ProdPerfect. And ProdPerfect is a software platform that autonomously tests web applications for regression.
And as an ex-IT guy, I love everything that you're doing here. And I've seen all too often what happens when you don't test. But before we dig a little bit deeper in on that, one of the questions I always like to ask my guests is not just about the technology, but what is your origin story? I mean, where did your passion for technology come from? And ultimately, what was it that put you on the path you're on today?
This could go way too far back. Like this is one of those like origin of time things where like I had to talk about how my parents met. But I grew up on all things. I grew up on a farm, and from like a military background. So actually, my parents are not involved in this, except for the fact that my mother saw that like I had this spark as a kid, where she'd be like, "Do you want to play outside?" I'd be like, "No, I want to play with Legos." And of course, the alternative, the third alternative being video games, but we weren't allowed to have them when I was young, and we were on a farm, so we were very far from everyone. So it was either Legos or outside, right? And so I'd play with Legos, and my mom essentially started like upping the ante slowly and like getting me more and more complex stuff to play with. And then at some point, 1995 came around, and a computer showed up, and like Windows 3.1 crashed, and I started messing around with MS-DOS. And that's kind of where it all began. So we fast forward. I get into MIT because in school I was like bored, and I would like doodle stuff or like write programs on my TI-83 calculator, and actually submitted all of those like designs and programs as part of my application. Got into MIT, suddenly surrounded by a bunch of nerds, and learned what's cool about MIT is I learned more from them than I did the professors. Not that the professors weren't great. I just spent more time with the other nerds. And so that's my love for technology was incrementally, it's like came about incrementally. And my passion for this project in particular was came from the fact that after I graduated at MIT, I went to consulting for like factories and mines and refineries, stuff like that. So totally unrelated. Wasn't doing software, but I was fixing broken processes. And because like it turns out just like bad decision making is at the root of every factory that's not working well, and I started like developing this kind of this like outrage that so many bad processes exist in the world, and it was costing the world so much in terms of like efficiency and like ability to deliver what people need to where people need it, and so I did that for a bunch of time. And ended up meeting Dan, my co-founder, who stayed in the software space at another startup, a hardware startup, which doesn't even bear a story at this point. But as we were, this project in particular started when he and I were traveling to Poland for fun, and we were like 5 vodkas in, And Dan knew he wanted me to be his like salesy, like businessy founder. And so he knew just how to hook me by like griping about how bad decision-making and bad process is at the root of a lot of failed software. And I had this like tell me more moment when he just planted the seed that he had an idea about how to fix it. And I don't want to say the rest is history, but there's a lot more of the story that we could tell as we go.
Love that. What a great story. And I love how that path led you to ProdPerfect, where you are today. But there will be a lot of people listening all over the world that are hearing about it for the first time. So just to bring everyone on the same page, can you set the scene? Tell me a little bit more about the kind of problems that you set out to solve with this technology, and also what it is that makes you different from other solutions out there.
Sure. So conventionally, software testing, there's a whole lot to software testing. And so the like remedial course is that functional software testing, its primary job is to catch bugs in applications. And of course, pre-ProdPerfect, people are testing software. And there's various levels at which people test. So if you've ever been to a good software class, you need to write unit tests for your own code to make sure your code works. We don't worry about that, right? Developers write unit tests. Good discipline can actually help them a lot. There's integration testing, where you test to make sure essentially like your modules can talk to each other. I know, a little remedial, but then there's end-to-end testing. And so there's all sorts of other non-functional kinds of testing, like testing for performance and speed and whether you can handle load. But in the bug catching world, the third kind of testing is end-to-end testing. And this is the one where you actually test the application to make sure the application works as a whole. So the old school way of doing it is manually, right? Just click around the application. Can I log in? Can I check out? And then Selenium came along in like 2004. Don't hold me to it. But then you could do it automatically. You could write a script and it would do that thing for you. So you didn't have to check out yourself every time. And there have been all sorts of innovations on making Selenium or Selenium type code, either lower code or more stable or faster, sort of like faster horses kind of thing. And Dan wants to fix, or Dan decided his big idea was that he wanted to fix the problem at a more fundamental point. So here's the big problem with software testing, end-to-end testing, is end-to-end testing, because you have to launch the browser and click around it and wait for the network to get back. It takes an excruciatingly long time. It's unstable. And what happens, the other problem is that when your application gets big enough, the testers don't know whether they've written the right tests anymore. You can like compare stuff to requirements sort of, but like that data isn't this, like the data for a requirement, the data for the test aren't the same. So you have to like have one person try to wrap their head around it. So what ends up happening with like any of these solutions, like any tool that humans are using to test an application, is you build a whole pile of tests because you're not sure what to test. You're still missing important stuff. So bugs are getting through because you're not sure what to test. Your tests take a very long time and they have stability issues. So stability issues are like the test will fail even though there's not a bug, because like you made, either because you made some change in the application or something about your test environment is different. And they require tons of maintenance. So you're putting in a lot of effort. You're not catching all the bugs. And perhaps the worst part is it's costing you a lot of runtime in the deployment. So end-to-end testing is like the last big hurdle we need to break down in order to be able to achieve like continuous delivery, continuous development. So with all that, how are we fixing it? Rather than be a tool, what we're doing is we are autonomously building an end-to-end test suite by analyzing traffic on the application. We see what users actually do. The analysis is like really gnarly to cut out the noise. And then the really, really gnarly step is translating that analysis into actual end-to-end tests, but we can do it. And so we learn what users do on the application, and then we test to make sure that with your latest update, users can always do what they want to do on the application. And this allows us to actually build a much, much smaller test suite that's more stable, runs faster, can support high-speed deployments, and you don't have to do it. Like you don't have to, your team doesn't have to build or maintain these tests. So that's why we do it and what we do.
And it's so refreshing to hear an approach like that and hear how it should be done rather than what I've witnessed over the years. But when I was doing a bit of research before you came on the podcast, I did learn that you'd helped dozens of cutting edge, venture backed, hotshot brand names, companies, and all their elite engineering teams to radically improve their software quality and deployment speed. And of course, that is where the magic happens. But I've got to ask, just to bring to life everything that we're talking about here, do you have any client stories maybe? You don't have to mention their names, but just that you could share that would bring to life everything that we're talking about.
Yeah, actually one that comes to mind in particular, and you're right, I can't share their name, but they're a giant e-com that everyone here has heard of. It's actually one of the tough parts about being like in infrastructure, or actually testing in particular, is that people are very sensitive about quality, so they don't always want to share their logo that like they bought help for testing. But anyway, it's an e-com, everyone's heard of it, and what was happening was that for them, end-to-end testing had slowed them down so much that they abandoned it entirely, which is actually becoming more common, that people just go like, they just chuck their Selenium test suite, and like other companies want to come around and be like, here's a better version of Selenium. Do you want to do that? And people are so scarred. They go, no, I'm not even going to bother. Right. It's just not worth it. Yeah. And so what they were doing is they actually didn't have any kind of test environment. They were shipping straight to prod. And what they were doing was actually a practice that's becoming more common. And it's actually a good practice. You should do it anyway. But they were relying entirely, after their unit test ran, on launching, like using a launch darkly type application, a canary, or to a canary, with feature flags, right? So they'd feature flag the new feature on, they launch to a canary, and they just have like really sophisticated application performance monitoring to see if like GMV crashed, or if like, checkout conversion rate crashed. And if it crashed, they'd roll it back. And this allowed them to move pretty fast because they could ship to prod right away. But if something went wrong, if there was a bug, it was a disaster, and not necessarily a disaster for, it was a contained disaster. And this is how they handled it, was the fact that, one, the number of users impacted was pretty small. And then two, after they'd roll it back, it would be a disaster for whatever team just shipped the bug, because like they've been working for weeks on this deployment and something went wrong. And the only forensics that they have are the fact that like the APM caught something awful. So this was a pain in the butt for them, but it was like the only way that they were able to achieve high-speed deployments before working with us, because of all these problems of end-to-end testing. When we ended up engaging with them, there's this like whole dramatic story of this like 2-week trial about whether we would catch any app-breaking bugs. We actually caught a bug among some others that broke checkout, and we were like, back at the little tiny ProdPerfect office, we're like, yeah, right, like we caught the checkout bug. And of course the head of QA said like, well, look, you catch another one of those, you've paid for yourself for years, so let's go. And but by bringing us on, they actually had to make some changes to reintroduce some test infrastructure. But what it allowed them to do, they're using virtual machines. So they spin up a virtual machine, they run ProdPerfect. We've broken ProdPerfect down, or they've been able to break ProdPerfect down into like different parts of the application. So like, here's checkout, here's search, and because they have some good backend architecture, they can isolate some of the regression testing. Long story short, is because they can run us now as part of their deployment, and it takes like 15 minutes. So it only adds like 15 minutes to their deployment. So it's like go get a coffee kind of thing. You come back, and instead of just like, oh gosh, APM caught something, and now I have to roll back this whole feature, we're able to test on every single merge of this huge company. So we're able to run an end-to-end regression test suite on every single merge. So we're able to test on the smallest possible chunk of code, right? Which means that, and immediately, and for the developer who wrote the code. So the developer hits deploy, they get an end-to-end test suite run that gives them the feedback directly. And it means that if they broke something, end-to-end tests can't point where in the code you broke something, but they can point where in the application you broke something. And they could know, well, look, I only wrote these like 50 lines of code, so it's in there somewhere, and I'm still in flow, right? I haven't context switched yet. So it allows them to like very, very quickly fix the bugs that they produce and then do their canary deploy. And long story short, we're still trying to figure out how to measure this, but like everyone knows kind of thing that developer velocity is much, much higher. And for a team of like hundreds of engineers, you can start to imagine what like the dollar value on that is. And so what's interesting is like we always thought we'd be a QA play, but we've been most successful, including for this e-com enterprise, when we are a like developer velocity and continuous deployment support play, where you need to get the testing right, but the whole point of it is to help people move faster without breaking. Like the whole like Mark Zuckerberg move fast, break things. Like, can we move fast, not break things? Turns out we can.
And one other thing I think every business is waking up to now is the power of data. They're all surrounded by so much data everywhere. It's now all about trying to understand that data and make data-driven decisions rather than just going off a hunch. So what really interests me is in the world of software development, especially as a discipline, in testing, why is it so bad at using data? Can you share any insights around that?
Dan actually, I'm working with Dan on an article right now, which we'll be posting live about cargo cults. And so for those who don't know cargo cults, the long story short is like on some Pacific islands during the Second World War, where the people who lived there, their first contact with the outside world was the United States Army showing up or the Japanese Army showing up and like building a tiny little airstrip. And so what would happen is, a bunch of people would show up, they build an airstrip, a plane would land, and like all sorts of cool stuff would come out of the plane. And like sometimes the troops would like share or trade with the people who lived on the island. And so, but because people didn't understand how any of this worked, like planes, right? And like they didn't, the army didn't bother like communicating with them because they had a war to fight. So these cargo cults emerged where what happened was, the people who lived on the island like used sticks and such to build fake airfields, and they'd actually like march around in formation with like sticks as rifles in the hopes of summoning the airplane. Because like it was like a rain dance or like a prayer for whatever, right? That all sorts of other people do. Like we laugh at these people, but of course the rest of us do it all the time, just in ways that we haven't figured out how the airplane works yet. So we do the cargo cult thing. And so cargo cults are actually surprisingly common in software as well. It's not just testing. I think testing, like, it's the redheaded stepchild of software, like it's a bad rap, but it's not like QA people are like as a discipline, not as smart as everyone else. It's in part of the problem with testing is that it hasn't gotten as much love as other parts of the deployment or other parts of software from the venture community. I think like the VC world and startup founders like us have been a little bit lazy about how we fix testing. But why is software as a whole bad at using data or like using these data-driven decisions? I think it's fundamentally because like we are more than we think playing with technology that is moving so fast that like we don't quite understand it anymore. We don't have time to like fully get our head around it fast enough. And like, especially as tech leaders, we have to be like smart enough to be dangerous with so many different kinds of technology that we can't become experts in it in the way that, like, for example, ProdPerfect are experts in testing. And what that means is like we need to trust. We need to like have a high level, our technology leaders have to have a high level of trust for the people around them. And we don't know enough to challenge the decisions that people are making with the technology that they're using. Fundamentally, this means that like the best technology leaders are kind of like knocked out of the game to be able to get deep enough into something to use data to challenge it. So why are lower level people not using these data-driven decisions? Well, in part because they're not rewarded for them. And the reason they're not rewarded for them is that like and here's the final problem, that the output is opaque. So here's what I mean. If I told you I'd done something to like increase developer velocity, how would you actually measure that? We actually don't know how to measure that, right? Like, is it lines of code? Well, you could measure lines of code, but like any good technology leader knows that that's a terrible proxy for how effective your developers are. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we can say, hey, we caught this bug. How much would this bug have cost if it got out? Well, you can do some guesswork to try to figure it out, but like how long would it have been there before it showed up and how many people would have run into it? And And like, if it's something where, the checkout button moved a little bit, like maybe you've A/B tested this in the past, you have some idea, but you mostly don't have an idea of like how much these unexpected things affect your revenue, for example. And so ultimately, I think like to have a little bit of sympathy for the software world, one of the reasons we're bad at making fact-based decisions is that it is very, very hard to measure what is the fundamental KPI that we're trying to mess with. And if it was easy to measure that, I think we'd be better at it, right? We would go, okay, developer velocity, we measure it in, I don't know, like we'll just call it like groks per hour, right? If like groks per hour was a thing that we could measure, we could say, hey, look, we implemented this technology or this process. Did our groks per hour go up or go down? We'd be making these much more data-driven decisions. But because it is very hard to know, like in a measurable or to measure how we have added value, we rely on the intuition of our experts in our team to tell us whether something probably improved or not. And because we can't challenge that, we accept what people say. And because we accept what people say, it turns into dogma. And this is the cargo cult thing. So we change something, like someone else changed something and like, the plane showed up and we got chocolate. Right. Or like someone else implemented Kubernetes and like, look at them. They went and raised, a Series C. So like they must be using the right technology. So we should implement Kubernetes. Do we know it's going to fix anything? No. But other people are doing it. It seems to be working out pretty well. So we're going to try it. Now that's a little unfair. Like there's a lot of good story behind why Kubernetes makes sense or all sorts of like, infrastructure deployment decisions make sense, but we don't actually have the data to do any better than this kind of cargo cult style. It seems to, they did X, it seems to have worked out for them. Let's try it.
And it is incredibly difficult, like you said. And one of the things that is helping people make more sense of vast quantities of data is things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I'm curious, how is AI in testing changing software development and testing, of course, too? Is there anything that you're seeing there?
I think in the long term, to your point, like AI can start picking out some of the very, very disparate bits of data where like, okay, you have all these deployments and like, in the aggregate, kind of if we cut out the noise, what kind of impact do they have? Like if you're an e-com on GMV or something like that, right? And you can start to then like do a lot of correlating over vast numbers or like sets of essentially like code data. And so like there's this long term where like, can AI in theory help us start to make better fact-based decisions across the board? Yes. The reason we're able to do this so well in testing right now, and in contrast, the reason you don't see AI popping up in other parts of software development is that in particular with at least end-to-end testing, the fundamental theory, not everyone agrees with this. So this is part of the philosophy problem, right? So like same as just this previous conversation, people have different dogmas about this, but the dogma that I accept is the point of end-to-end testing is make sure your users can do the things that they want to do. And unlike so many other things, now, there are some things where you do have this data, but unlike so many other places, like our users happen to be telling us all the time exactly what they want to do by doing it, right? And it sounds a little bit tautological, but it's actually like kind of a big insight. And I think this is why there was like such a gaping maw here for ProdPerfect to come in and fill, is because of this like cargo cult problem everywhere else in software. Nobody started snooping around going, where can we use more data? Or where can we exploit more data? And except it like product world's doing that really well. Just engineering's not. And it took a little bit of like spark of genius where you bring these two dynamos together and like, the electricity pops between them to realize like, oh, okay, we can start exploiting data here. And AI can only work if you have data to exploit, right? AI can only work when you have, and it's like well-formed, consistent data of consistent of a sort. And so it becomes hard to imagine seeing AI rolling out in the short term to many other parts of software, because the prerequisite is we have really good data that tells us something interesting as long as you can sort through it. But customer usage tells us a lot. Now, it also happens to be the case. So to wrap up your first question, how is AI changing testing? In short, it can take all sorts of stuff that we use to try to measure whether we blew it or not. In terms of how customers use the application, we can take that APM data, which ProdPerfect's not even doing yet. If someone else wants to do, great. Like, take that application performance monitoring data where like you see GMV crash or you see checkout crash or something like that, and use that to like trace, to do some like better bug tracing on a deployment and stuff like that. But it is the case that because a single deployment or a singular deployment, if you're moving fast enough, can change so much, right? It can change user pathways. It can change, performance, other stuff like that. You can get that feedback loop set up and like use machine learning to do a whole lot of stuff to make automated decisions about what to do based on this feedback that you get. It's going to be a while until like AI breaks out into other areas, because it's not obvious, at least to me, it's not obvious where that robust data set is coming from.
And on the topic of machine learning, if we browse through any news feed there, it's coming for, the narrative is it's coming for parts of, if not all of our jobs. But I do think that the businesses that try and replace people with machine learning are the ones going to struggle. It's the ones where they invest in their people too and allow people and technology to work alongside each other. They're going to be the ones that move quicker.
I couldn't agree more, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but what benefits do you think both businesses and employees can unlock by embracing it and accelerating its adoption, but by working side by side rather than relying on just one of them?
I am super passionate about this, that like if we do it well, and I happen to believe in the market, so I think we will figure out how to do it well. It's just gonna be like painful in the meantime. The major benefit, I think, like the highly aligned benefit of for like employers and employees with AI is that machines are good at doing the stuff that we've already turned into like a fairly rote or like highly repeatable and essentially boring part of your job.
Yeah.
And this has actually been true of like the various industrial revolutions. What happens is like humans build processes that become fairly repeatable and then boring, and then they get automated away. And so it's like we've already become, the way I think about it is that humans spend part of their time being robots, and then the market builds some robots to take over the robot parts, and humans move on to other stuff. A good example is like manufacturing, right? Like manufacturing used to be like completely artisan, right? And figuring out how to build anything from like, in the Civil War, like a rifle pre-Civil War, a rifle was like it was an artisan thing, but it got like, as people honed techniques, it got more and more and more repeatable until you could get machines to do it. And like the artisan part, artisans were like hanging on to rifle making, but like it had become quite boring and bespoke. And the amount of expertise and creativity required had dropped over time. And that's the really important thing. This is also true in software development, right? I knew someone, she passed away some time ago, but like during the Second World War was like programming machines by like, looking at cards with like punch holes in them and trying to like get machines to do calculations so that like very, very long range artillery could like hit the Germans. Right. And she was awesome. She was like one of the early programmers, and various parts like 99% of her job is now automated, right? And or at least abstracted, right? And that abstraction is a form of automation. Like I can just type in a command in JavaScript, and like 99% of her day is now gone. And so long story short is I think we've already been going through various forms of, even in the software world, various forms of automation that have made software development, one, more efficient, which is good for the employer, two, more valuable, which is why you can like, walk into San Francisco as a software developer and say, like, I'll take $250,000, please, even though I don't have like an advanced degree in software development. I just have some experience, which is awesome. And 3, like, it's not super boring, and it's going to stay not super boring because the most boring parts are going to keep getting eaten up by automation. But in this case, we're using AI and machine learning to do it, because the thing that's becoming boring is like taking highly dispersed data sets of stuff and like turning them into insights. Well, that's just math. And it's not the most exciting math, right? It's not like cutting edge number theory math. We can get machines to do it. It's a great thing. The analogy I like to use is, look, Neil, tell me, would you rather like be outside breaking rocks all day as part of a chain gang, or would you rather be a sculptor?
Sculptor all day long.
Right. Both jobs require a hammer and a chisel.
Yeah.
Right. Both jobs, what you are doing with your time is you are like putting the chisel up to the rock and hitting it with a hammer. The reason sculpting is so much more attractive is because it is using like the creative, engaged part of our mind to break the rocks, right? And like people need to stop thinking about their jobs as rock breaking and stop being afraid of machines coming and taking over the like outside, like breaking off a giant piece of marble thing, because that's boring and dumb. And more think of their job as like the keyboard is my hammer and chisel, and like I can spend that time rock breaking or I can spend it sculpting, and which would I rather do? Like, don't worry, we're not going to run out of problems anytime soon to fix with software. The more we have AI here helping us, the more of those problems we're going to solve. You'll probably make more money doing it, and you'll enjoy it more.
I completely agree with you there. And what a way of delivering that message too. Incredibly powerful. Nice. But one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today was what really stood out for me is I was reading about your belief on how to have nerves of steel and take a stand on about doing the right thing for the business, despite incredible political pressure or pressure from venture capitalists and investors, etc. So I've got to ask, based around that, do you have any entertaining war stories you could share that'll just help first-time founders that are listening out there about breaking the rules sometimes?
I have some more stories that I can't yet share, which like after we IPO, I'd like love to come back on the show and like share, and like we'll just do the war stories. But I've got a few that I can share. Yeah. One of them is there's like various times you have to like stare down your investors. And like the first time is before they're even investors. It's when you're fundraising. And what happens is like, everyone, a lot of people say like, oh, investors are dumb and lazy. And the thing is like, it's not that they're dumb and lazy. It's that there are like highly repeatable parts of their job that they also have to, there are highly repeatable parts of their job that they just like kind of have to go through the motions on. There are parts of their job where it's like very hard, just like with software development, to like get good data. And therefore like they have to play a little bit of the cargo cult game as well. And so like sympathy for the devil a little bit, the investors will ask the wrong questions frequently, but it's not because they're dumb or lazy. It's because of like the nature of the job they're in. They're trying to develop patterns. And a big part of our job that I think like people don't understand, especially young founders, right? People who have like just come out of school. We don't understand that like a big part of our job is to sometimes tell the investor they're asking the wrong question, because we come out of school and like, so there's just an example where I had to do this, where an investor was asking what our CAC and margin were, what our economics were 9 months into our business existing. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's because we'd sold so much stuff already, because people love, like people basically just need to like hear how ProdPerfect works and then they want to buy it. Right. And so we'd sold a bunch of it, and like, and we were transparent with people. We're like, just so it basically doesn't work yet. Like, here's how we're kind of doing it in the background. We had wildly negative margins because we had so much human support, because we hadn't built the actual back-end automation yet. And so an investor is asking what our margin is. And I said, well, it's negative. Right. And we had this like stare down moment where he's like, what? And I had to look at him and say, look, you realize we're 9 months into this adventure. Like, our margins now have absolutely nothing to do with what our margins will be in 5 years. Right. And like, you're investing in what is this product going to be in 5 years? What are the economics going to be in 5 years? The economics now are like less than irrelevant. And the fact that and it turns out they're an indicator of like why this is so hard and why there's like a natural technological moat and why this is in fact a great investment and not a bad one. But I know that like a lot of founders, when they get that question, they're so used to school where there is a professor who is asking a question that they already know the answer to, or at least think they do, and there is a right answer, and you'd better get the answer right. I also think like we're unfortunately taught to think about this with investors, where like the investor asks a question, like we better have the right answer for them, or else we won't get investment, right? But that assumes that the investor already knows everything they need to know. And the thing is, not only do they not know what they need to know about your business, but they don't even know the right questions to ask about your business. Only you know the questions to ask about your business to be able to assess whether they are the right questions. And so my first bit of advice is fundraising, direct what questions should be asked, and push back on the ones that shouldn't be asked or are not relevant now, right? And it's from said war story. It's not much of a war, right? But we did end up getting investment. The other war story that I want to share today is from much later with a bunch of investors on our board, where we had to like really, really go to bat for like something that we believed in. But I think I know it ended up being the right thing. So one thing that has like been a product of like the pandemic and then the like summer of kind of like protest and reckoning from George Floyd being murdered was we, one, had to like slow the business down a little bit because of the pandemic. And two, we had to think about like what really mattered to us, right? And we've always been a values-driven company, but we hadn't always thought about how that translates down into like how we do business with our employees. Sometimes we did, right? But there was some, like everyone, sometimes we just do the cargo cult thing and be like, oh, what are you guys doing? Okay, we'll do the same thing and hope that the plane comes. And one thing we decided to challenge internally that like, turns out investors wanted us to ask permission rather than forgiveness for this, but I didn't know that, was we decided to make all of our salary information open internally. So everyone knew total comp. Everyone knew exactly what everyone was making: salary, bonus, equity, including the founders. And the other thing we did was we benchmarked it against external data, market data. Why did we do this? It was because it turns out like there's plenty of studies that support this, like generally white men, but you can kind of like find a whole spectrum where this is true, are like tend to make more money for the same job than other people, right? And some of it might be inherent bias, some of it might be like we're not quite sure the cause, as much as like a lot of people like to claim they're sure of the cause, right? Is it inherent bias in the employer? Is it that like white men are encouraged by society to negotiate, right? And like are rewarded for pushing hard and negotiating, and other people are punished for it? Doesn't matter. What we decided to do was just say, well, look, we're just going to match everyone's salary to the external benchmark based on their role. And we're going to make it public so that we hold ourselves accountable to it, so that, and we just don't negotiate salary. We have a system. It turns out like that whole thing got very, very complicated about exactly how do like people get automatic, raises and such. Not automatic, but raises triggered by objective events rather than their negotiation. But people loved it. And when the investors found out about this, because they were asking about morale, I was like, oh yeah, morale's up. We did this thing. They lost it, or at least some of them lost it. And the reason they lost it was they were afraid that essentially that it was like exposing us to liability, because like the more people know, the more they can use something against you. If you have like, employees who have bad intent. And I happen to think like in this case, that's not true. It's just like kind of a knee-jerk reaction. But I also think that the investors are they're very used to, and this is the same conversation about like using data, right? Like, do they have data saying that sharing salaries is bad? No, it's just that nobody does it. So it must be a bad idea, right? Right. And so like, again, looking around, seeing what does everyone else do? It probably works, is like not a good venture capital or not a good startup strategy, right? Because the whole point is challenging everything, but it's what our brains tend to do. And so we had this freak out. And at some point, one of them in particular was very not happy about it. And I said, look, if you want to fire me, you can fire me, but I'm going to keep it. And we had this stare down because I think this person was like trying to convince me to change my mind. But like I needed to make very clear it was not going to change my mind. And if it was like sufficiently important, like he could try to get me out of the business. But this was sufficiently important to me that like we are just wasting our time by having this argument. And to wrap this story up, that stare down moment, I think actually like radically improved our relationship because like we have to remind investors every now and then that like we run the company and they invested in us to let us run the company, right? And they're there to advise, they're there to like give us support, they're there to challenge us, right? As is everyone around us. Our employees are here to challenge us as well about the decisions we make. But it comes down to us at the end. And one of the things I decided, or that we decided together, because I actually like took this advice was we would check in every now and then to see if like something blew up in our faces from this. And if it does, we'd reassess. And it turns out, look, I wouldn't be telling the story if anything did blow up in my face. It's been great for retention. We have our retention is like probably the best in the industry, period. We have had like a total of 2 people voluntarily leave the company ever in the last 4 years. One of them to go get a product role because we didn't have a product team at the time. One of them because he was basically ready to retire. And but nobody else has ever voluntarily left. And it's because of the way that it is very, very clearly because of the way that we run kind of everything about our company culture. And the salary transparency is a big part of it. It's where the founders have clearly like put their money where their mouth is in terms of company values, transparency being the first of them. So I think it's been a great move, and I don't get any more flack about it because like the numbers are there, right? Because the results are there, and us having like during the Great Resignation, nobody has resigned. Like nobody has left this company in the last 6 months or more, I think. But and I don't think anyone's going to because they can't imagine a better place to work.
Wow. And again, what a great story. I think that will resonate with a lot of startup founders listening. But as we dare to look into the future, what's next for ProdPerfect? What excites you about the road ahead?
So much. We just picked up a little bit more money. And so we're hiring some really key people for like the next level of the technology, which for us is more about scalability than it is about new features. Scalability is like, it's the big hard thing for ProdPerfect in part, for any AI type company, because it turns out that like AI is really good. If you think of like a half bell curve in terms of like frequency and difficulty of like problems to solve, the big lumpy part, which is like easy, high frequency, easy stuff, very easy for AI to figure out. The further you get along the long tail to these like thorny edge cases, the harder it gets. And so for us to be able to scale, we have to get like further and further down that long tail. And what that means, like the details, I have to kind of like hand wave away because they're like sufficiently, I guess proprietary is the word, but we're hiring some like really, really cool people to help us work on that, that are bringing in some expertise that the team didn't have so far. We're also like radically changing the thing I'm excited about, because I also look over the revenue side, is we're radically changing how we think about positioning our product. So the insight I share with you about, like, we used to think we're a QA product, and we're really a product that like enables continuous deployment and higher developer velocity using better testing. That's an insight that we had like a month ago. And it was from just like me and Dan wandering around, kind of like thinking openly about some of the challenges we're running into. That insight didn't happen there. It triggered a whole process that led to that insight. And so I get to like radically change how we do marketing and thought leadership and stuff like that. And that's a lot of where I have a lot of fun. But like in the medium term, now that we've got this money, it lets us go. Like, it lets us kind of push off when we have to raise our Series B, which allows us to like go command a much better price point, and therefore a lot more money. And so it's actually changing how we think about our Series B roadmap to go after a lot more stuff than just the web end-to-end testing marketplace. Because it turns out you can get the same kind, we talked about all the kind of data you can get. You can get performance data. You can get, performance data from load. You can get, you can use APM to like try to, now that's in prod, but like to still to like get you feedback on like better identified bugs, potential bugs across the board. And essentially like the more data you get in a given application, the more you roll up, the more you can actually start to find correlations that humans would like never be able to find. And therefore provide like not just a more hands-off QA experience, but a more intelligent QA experience that allows people to solve problems faster and fix bugs faster than they could before. And so for us, there's a like, I hate to say this word, but like synergistic or like non-linear value for our customer of linearly taking over more and more parts of QA as these like different bits work together, and like building out that functionality is going to be a lot of fun. A lot of our customers have been asking for it for a long time. So that'll be like kind of like the next big product thrust. And, it's not next week, but we're like starting to gear up for it now. And I think that's going to be, if people are like, oh, wow, now about ProdPerfect, like that's going to be the moment that like we're doing stuff that people, I think like won't believe until they see it.
Exciting times ahead indeed. Now, we did begin our conversation talking about your origin story. We've talked about the future and where you're heading. I'm going to throw a slight curveball at you now and ask you, was there a particular song that was the soundtrack to your career that's been ever present throughout, helps you get your head in the zone before going in a big meeting or delivering a keynote? Is there a particular song that means anything to you, and why? And maybe we can add it to our Spotify playlist.
I'm answering this suspiciously quickly because ProdPerfect actually has an unofficial theme song. It's going to become the official theme song because I know how much money it costs to get the commercial rights for it, and I want to put it in our marketing sometime. And I picked it. And long story about how I got to it, but before I tell you the song, so ProdPerfect's kind of part of our marketing essence or personality is space. And it seems like odd for a testing company, but it's essentially because like we think of every product launch as, and it's part of our culture. We think of our customers' product launches as like high speed and high stakes, right? Much like our rocket launch. And we think of ourselves as mission control. We're here to give you like a go, no go across the board for like whether you're ready to launch. And then like once you get that, it's like go be astronauts, right? Like don't you worry about it, we got it. And so I just had happened across this song by a band called Public Service Broadcast, and the song is called Go with an exclamation point. So Go exclamation point. And it is a song, it's like super nerdy, but the music is great. It's like very, very like tense and energetic, but it is a song from the perspective, or that sort of tells the story of mission control during the Apollo 11 moon landing. So like kind of across the, during the refrain, you actually have, it's not Gene Kranz, but it's Khan calling like the different flight directors to say go, right? So he'll say like retro, go. And so you have this kind of like climactic peak when they like finally, of like the tension in that room when they like successfully land on the moon. And I thought it was like very cool that like the folks in Mission Control who like almost nobody knows their names except for Gene Kranz. And even most people don't know Gene Kranz. Gene Kranz in Apollo 13 is the bald guy who says failure's not an option. Yeah. And that's probably where most people know him from. But from these like sort of no-name guys who are so critical to the success of the moon landing, so that like, so that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin can like go be big damn heroes. I think it is literally a song for the unsung heroes, and that's who we want to be. We want to be this like quiet unsung hero group for our customers to like go be big damn heroes. And so that is our theme song, and it gets me pumped up before a big meeting.
Man, absolutely love that. I'm looking forward to checking it out and for adding it to the playlist and for other people to check it out. And you went a bit Hitchcock on me. I thought you were luring me into a David Bowie type story. And then no, you went a little bit left field. So now I'm proudly have that nice. For the Spotify playlist. Now, for anyone listening that would like to find out more about ProdPerfect, what you're doing, if you've got a podcast, a website, what's the best way of finding you?
So for us, everything is still around the website because we don't have like much of a conventional marketing team. We're big on, I mean, you'll still see us in other places, but we've decided, you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute, but we've decided that kind of a very controversial, punchy in the nose thought leadership is how we're going to communicate with the world. Yeah. And so our blog is a great place to like really learn about who we are deep down. So the blog is just prodperfect.com/blog, but go to the website. It will like direct you to the right place depending on what you're looking for. If you're looking for white papers from us, if you're looking for a blog, if you're looking for, if you're looking for a demo, or even like some video of it, because you don't want to talk to sales yet. It is all like centered around the website, and we're like getting better at kind of like sending you to the place that you want to go rather than the place that we think you're supposed to go. So that's, I would strongly suggest just going to prodperfect.com and you'll be able to find whatever you want.
Cool. Well, I'll add all those links to the podcast show notes so people can find you nice and easily. I'd just love hearing more about your story, the song choice, and also just challenging businesses out there to challenge their own thinking about the right way to deploy software. But more than anything, just a big thank you for taking the time to come on here and share all that with me. I'd love to stay in touch with you, get you back on later in the year. And especially after IPO, we need to get those other stories out of you. But more than anything, thanks for joining me today.
Neil, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks. Have a great rest of the day. Can't wait for what comes next. And yes, I'd love to come back as some of these stories resolve. We could do like, ProdPerfect, the untold story part, and of like all the stuff that went terribly, terribly wrong in the years between. So anyway, thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Just love chatting with Erik today and learning more about why software development as a discipline, especially in testing, has traditionally been bad at using data, because software relies too heavily on human smarts. But that is changing thanks to the introduction of artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, and so much more. But more than anything, I think I just loved hearing about those startup stories from Erik and the days of being stubborn first-time founders who broke all the rules and the lessons learned along the way. But I think we only just scratched the surface there. So I will be inviting Erik back on in the future to try and get him to talk about some of those. But if you have a question or a startup story to share, please email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com, tweet me at Neil C. Hughes. And remember, my website is techblogwriter.co.uk if you'd like to work with me. But that is it for today's episode. So a big thank you as always for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.